This is the comment that I get pretty much weekly. A late diagnosed adult says to me, I grieve for the person I could have been today had I known I was PDA as a child. So much guilt and pain and grief, but so much fantasy and wishful thinking too. Now, normally your fantasy or your inner world building is your PDA business. But I feel like I need to pop this little bubble because autistic adults are using this myth to hurt themselves. I'm going to talk about mourning our lack of early intervention as late recognized autistic people. I'm not an expert, and I'm not going to tell anybody what to do with their family or their kid. I'm only speaking on this because I hope to alleviate some of the guilt, pressure, and shame that families feel when we somehow fail to recognize our child's neurodivergence early enough, or that we feel about our own unmet childhood needs. I want to lessen our late recognition burden. I do not wish to villainize parents who have been forced to put their kids into some kind of therapy, whether they believe in it or want to or not. They've had their autonomy taken away by a school or a judge or a doctor. Nor do I want to put down or speak over families that are dealing with comorbid conditions that require treatment, aid, support, or medication. I wish we all had more choices. I am not an adult advocate that's going to tell other families that they need to do what I'm doing or that we should never ever do XYZ. And I'm definitely not going to say that there's only one thing that PDAers need, and that's to be left alone with as much freedom as possible. No, we are all different, and we're all in vastly different circumstances. If you are a family who is able to access and afford these interventions and they are helping your child who is willingly participating and enjoying them, then great, I support you. But I also support the families that cannot afford or access those services. Those of us who didn't find out in time to use them, or families who have chosen to opt out because what was available in their area was actually harming their child and not helping them. I'm going to get into it now, and it's going to be long and nuanced. The whole thing will be over on my Shmoo Shmoob. First, I'm going to get into what it really would have been like to have been diagnosed in the 80s or 90s. I will be mentioning personal and community trauma. This is your chance to scroll on. Then after that, I'll get into what I think late recognized autistic people really mean when we say that we wish we'd known earlier. Because frankly, I don't wish I had known earlier. I don't think I was ready. I hadn't unpacked enough internalized ableism. I don't think I would have been able to accept it without the neurodiversity movement, the voices of other PDA neurokin, or the positivity of all the other neurodivergent families out here embracing neurodivergent identity and culture. I was not ready to hear about PDA one more minute earlier than I did. I was recognized as ADHD and dyscalculia at 18. Professor Elizabeth Newson's work on PDA wasn't published until 2003, and I was 26 years old. And I wasn't recognized as PDA until I was 42 years old, and that was in 2019. Before today, the autistic community couldn't share our experiences like this until video sharing was possible. I would not have been connected to people like me. There weren't websites full of information compiled by neurodiversity informed experts and also by autistic people ourselves. The only info available would have been from doctors, therapists, and teachers. There was a lot of bias in that info. And there were not free online assessments, and there was very little, possibly none, positive autistic identity and culture. It was really seen as a problem, as a disorder that needed to be fixed. So let's talk about the neurodivergent bad old days, the 80s and 90s. There's a lot of autistic adults today who consider themselves survivors of abuse that was disguised as treatments that were offered people like me back during the time I was growing up in. They experience institutionalization, incarceration, restraint, isolation, mismedication, tranquilization, manipulation, shock treatments, consent violations, sensory torture, gaslighting, and worse. Many feel that they were trained to betray themselves, to hide their suffering and mask their sensory needs, to accept torturous abuse. Today, they feel like what they needed was loving kindness. Somebody to listen to them, to see them and accept them, to let them be themselves, to let them move and make sounds that they needed to make to feel good in their body, to communicate the way that they need to play with kids like them, and autonomy. They needed autonomy. I actually did receive some early recognition. After all, Mrs. Lucas, my kindergarten teacher, called me the R slur in front of everyone. And I did receive some in school therapies like speech, but being taken out of class for speech or for gifted classes was very othering, and it only increased my social awkwardness. The speech therapy made me feel incredibly insecure, and I became very afraid to talk or sing, and it didn't do shit to fix my lisp or my stutter, just like more math homework did not do anything to fix my dyscalculia. I did not get paddled or locked in a closet or have my mouth taped shut. I was not restrained, but that was threatened many times, and I saw it done to my neurodivergent classmates. I'm sort of fine with the way that I made it through school. I ended up with straight A's and graduating. I made it. So I cannot speak for all the people who didn't. Knowing that I was autistic back then would not have gotten me anything helpful. Yeah, the stigma of the 1980s got me labeled things like bratty, flaky, bossy, picky, old soul, indigo child, too smart for my own good, and lazy. But my kooky, arty weirdness also was a bat signal that brought a lot of really cool weirdos into my life. And being identified early as autistic might have isolated me away from those weirdos, kept me too busy for art or theater. And as somebody who requires autonomy like air, the coercion, repetition, and manipulation of the therapies available at that time would have been so hard for child me to take. And I feel angry and alien just thinking about it. I'm so thankful that I never had to endure some of the stuff that my foremothers endured. So if the treatment that's available even now is flawed and controversial, why does our community feel so much guilt and longing around this? Early intervention, it's a multi-billion-dollar business in the US, and a lot of money has been spent on propaganda by hate groups convincing us that testing, therapies, classes, and materials need to be bought as many as possible as early as possible. IEPs, lawyers, specialists, aides, OTs, place therapy, speech therapy, behavioral therapy. And if we did every single thing recommended to us, we would have no free time, no friends, no playtime, no family time, no travel. Because of all the messages we've received, we can have so much guilt if our child's autism is discovered later than age 2. If we ourselves are not recognized until adulthood, many of us grieve the life that we imagine we might have had if we'd received a childhood diagnosis. And it's so tempting to believe all that propaganda that tells us how transformational the therapies and programs can be. And so when we're adults in burnout and traumatized and exhausted, it can be so tempting to blame everything going wrong on our unsupported, unrecognized neurodivergence. Our life would have been so much better with accommodations, understanding, and community. Yeah, but would it have been better with early intervention? With 80s early intervention? I think that what some of us probably mean is that we wish our parents and teachers had been kinder, more accommodating and understanding, that our classmates hadn't bullied us for our traits, that our sensory needs had been met, and that we'd had accommodations and educational supports, that we'd been recognized, understood, and allowed to be ourselves. that we'd have known there were millions of people like us, that we'd have had autistic mentors, leaders, elders, historical icons guiding us from an early age, and that recognition would have meant fewer demands and more love. Unfortunately, an early diagnosis doesn't necessarily mean any of that would have happened. Even today, with all the internet resources, all of us neurodivergent adults out here trying to tell y'all how it is, so many educators and healthcare providers have wildly out of date information. I was one of them until just 2 years ago. So many parents won't do a smidge of research into autistic identity and culture. They won't adjust their parenting in the slightest to accommodate their diagnosed child's sensitivities or needs. They just want the child to be different. A lot of the early intervention that was available in my area was not necessary for my speaking, well physically coordinated social children. And today we don't need behavioral guidance to keep them in school. You see, my kids unschool, which means they don't have to tolerate the classroom environment, a curriculum, unsolicited instruction, or endure punishment and reward systems. We're really, really privileged to be able to provide them with self-directed homeschool because it means we don't have to train them to endure a school day's sensory input or to perform the compliance necessary to please teachers and classmates. Some disciplinary techniques and therapies are really most useful to fit kids inside of a box. And I wish that we could just take all the boxes away. But I know that that's my fantasy, and that even my kids, as privileged as they are, won't be able to escape all the boxes either. And I want to say that if I or my kids do end up needing medication, therapy, or treatment in the future, I'm not against it. I pray we'll be able to A, find it, and B, afford it. As for accessibility aids, sensory materials, and other enrichment, it's pretty homemade, but we are currently getting that at home. We are really lucky, really privileged. For many families, therapies and interventions are forced on them, and many of us need help. Need to learn how to take care of this autistic body mind, and our caregivers need help to adjust their lens and accept neurodiversity and learn how to accommodate and care for us. And sometimes our little people are hurting themselves, their siblings or us. And if your family has been helped by any program or therapy or treatment, I am so incredibly happy for you. And I know that many things are radically different than they were back in the 1900s. I have found the PDA community life-giving. Just knowing my neurotype has helped me immensely. It was something I knew was going on with me since birth, and I have been looking for the name PDA my whole life. Being in connection with parents like me has been so positive, and I've let go of so much toxic internalized ableism, and I've become a better parent and wife. I've found peace about my unconventional life choices through understanding my nervous system's need for autonomy. Would it have been great to have grown up feeling connected, seen, and understood as a neurodivergent person? Yeah, it would. It would have. Will growing up in the community with neurodiversity informed parents help my kids? I hope so. Is not having that the root of all my generation's problems? No, there's a lot more to our oppression than that, unfortunately. Grieve if you must, but don't waste battery on fantasies that hurt your feelings, especially if they're based on propaganda and internalized ableism. If what you really wish is that we could be more loved, understood, free, and accepted, it's never too late for that.